This is the Unit 6 graded assignment, Making Your Case, a Collection Development Topic Debate. Ditching Dewey, an Argument by Emily Joelle. So, Melville Dewey published a uniform system for organizing libraries in 1876. It was called the Dewey Decimal System, and today about 95% of all public libraries in the United States still use the Dewey Decimal System, as well as libraries in more than 138 countries. But there's so many reasons why we should no longer be using the Dewey Decimal System to organize our library collections. And this argument is going to explain some of those reasons. Because my experience is in the school system, this is where I will focus most of my argument since I can speak directly from experience in this case. However, I do want it to be known that I think abandoning the Dewey Decimal Classification System is beneficial in all libraries that currently use it as a means of organization. The thesis of this presentation is that we should ditch the Dewey Decimal Classification System in libraries because of 4 different reasons. First, Dewey's problematic history. Second, the oppressive and othering nature of this classification system. Third, the upkeep and how time-consuming it is for librarians. And fourth, its accessibility to patrons that causes it to be a very library-focused system of organization instead of a patron-focused system. I will now present the 4 different reasons why we should be ditching the Dewey Decimal System. First, Melville Dewey was a very problematic person. He has faced so many allegations of racism, anti-Semitism, sexual harassment, and these are not things that are just surfacing right now. In 1905, he was actually edged out of the ALA, so the American Library Association, because of these allegations of sexual assault. And the fact that he was edged out of a system where we are still honoring him by using his means of classifying libraries is in and of itself reason enough to abandon the Dewey Decimal System. Not only was Dewey accused of sexually harassing 4 different female ALA members, but he and his wife also owned a resort where he chose not to allow Jews or any BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, or people of color to enter or become club members. And this excluded some members of the actual ALA itself. According to an article by the Smithsonian Magazine, the ALA has been awarding a medal called the Melville Dewey Medal as a recognition for creative leadership in different fields such as classification, cataloging, library management, etc. And in this article, it discussed the fact that in 2019, the ALA actually decided to strip this medal of its name due to Dewey's history of racism, anti-Semitism, and sexual harassment. According to my research, I was not able to find proof of the fact that they actually have changed the name, and it seemed to be that they are still in the process of making that happen. So the question is, if Dewey is this problematic and harmful and has been for over 100 years, why are we still honoring him by calling our library system of organization after this man's name? It is time that we ditch Dewey. Secondly, the harmfulness and the othering that this system of organization creates is off the charts. So when determining why it's so important to ditch this system, it's so important to think about the harm that this system of organization causes many marginalized communities. In fact, it quite literally marginalizes communities who have already faced centuries of harm. This system of organization basically others pretty much everyone who's not a white, cisgender, heterosexual Christian male. You're going to see in my arguments that many of the problems that I mentioned are intertwined, but I will do my best to separate them in order to explain some of the ways that Dewey's upholding systems of white supremacy, Christian dominance, heterosexism, and more. Melville Dewey was a notorious sexist and a serial sexual harasser, and it's clear that these views that he held of women are reflected in his system of organization. One of the main examples of the sexism within the Dewey Decimal System is the fact that feminism and books about women's history are not placed in American history like you would imagine, but in fact are given their entire separate section in social sciences in the 300s. What this does is it others women. It treats women as though they are not a category of history in mainstream America, but in fact a social study that is a side note in American history. Another example of how sexism exists in the Dewey Decimal System is the concept of the Salem witch hunts. Books about the Salem witch hunts are oftentimes categorized in the 200s, along with books about witchcraft. The 200s are focused mainly on religion. And books about witchcraft are very, very different than the history of the Salem witch hunts. In fact, books about the practice of witchcraft are books about a belief system and clearly belong in the 200s with religion. But books about witch hunts are a part of history and ways in which women were persecuted in the past. And clearly, noting the word history, belong in the 900s with all of the other history books. Next, discussing the ways that racial bias plays a key factor in the way that Melville Dewey has organized our books in the library. First is the fact that most books and the way that they are organized reflect a very Eurocentric view. So as an example, newspapers, which can be classified in the 070s, are subdivided by different geographic areas. So 071 would be newspapers from North America. 072 would be newspapers from the British Isles. 071 up to 078 are all Western and European countries, whereas 079 shares all other geographic areas. This means that over half of the world's population is being categorized as literally other. Newspapers from Brazil, India, China, Japan, Australia, Egypt, South Africa, and more are all lumped into this one other category. Furthermore, when Dewey's system was first created, there were only 2 categories to hold the work of Black writers. And the only 2 numbers that were dedicated to Black writers were 325, which was a section on colonization, and 326, which was a section on slavery. And in fact, it stayed this way until Dorothy Porter, who was a librarian from Howard University, demanded that it be changed and explained to the world the problematic nature of this system of organization. There's also quite a bit of homophobia in the way that queer books are categorized within the Dewey Decimal System. And in fact, queerness was not even mentioned in the Dewey Decimal System whatsoever until the 1930s. And when it was mentioned for the first time, it was actually categorized as abnormal psychology. Michelle Drum, in her famous study around queerness and how it was classified in the Dewey Decimal System, mentions that she found traces of homosexuality classified as a neurological disorder and placed in the 616 section. Now, it might be some comfort that these Dewey Decimal numbers are no longer in use and that queerness has been moved to different sections of the library in terms of Dewey Decimal classification. And in fact, in 1989, it was moved from abnormal psychology, but it ended up in the social problems category. This means that books about queerness were often interfiled with pornography and obscenity and different topics of quote unquote social problems. Now, today, queer books have also been moved yet again and are now found in the 300 section, most commonly around 306. And while this is an improvement, queer books are still being categorized near prostitution, child trafficking, BDSM, and other such concepts, which does not truly match the essence of what queerness is. I would argue that the colonizer perspective is one of the most problematic concepts within the Dewey Decimal classification system, as dominant number categories are given to almost all Eurocentric concepts. So when we look at language, All of the numbers from 400 to 489 have been given to European cultures and languages. This is the same in the 800s, dealing with literature. From 800 to 889 is all dealing with Eurocentric, westernized literature. This means that the end of the 400s and the end of the 800s is where all other cultures and languages and forms of literature are being squeezed into the quote-unquote other category. In 2022, a man named Frederick conducted a study that was published in the Library High Tech News. And in this study, Frederick spoke about an experience he had categorizing a film created by an Indigenous producer and production team. And what Frederick found is that there was nowhere within the Dewey Decimal System to categorize this film. The film very prominently discussed the Indigenous worldview, and because that Indigenous worldview is so different from the Western culture and the Westernized worldview, it did not fit into any of the categories where it should have belonged. For example, many of the traditional teachings in the Indigenous worldview are based on traditions and concepts passed down orally from generation to generation. And these traditional type teachings are often classified in the 398 section of the Dewey Decimal System, which is where fairy tales would be categorized. And this video was obviously not a fairy tale. It was talking about the traditions of Indigenous culture. So using a classification number of 398 is infantilizing Indigenous knowledge and worldviews by comparing them to children's folk tales. Finally, the Dewey Decimal System of organization is also extremely Christian-centric. In fact, I would argue that this is probably the most glaringly obvious example of the colonizer and Christian culture that is dominating the system of organization. As you can see in front of you, the religion section is broken up into different categories. And from 200 to 280, we have all different forms of Christian topics. And once again, 290 is where we see all other of the thousands of world religions clumped into one quote unquote othered section. In fact, this section even ties into the racism of the Dewey Decimal System, because in the religion category, there's a section in the 200s that are literally for the religions of quote unquote Black people, Black Africans, and people of Black African descent. And that is number 299.6. The third reason why the Dewey Decimal Classification System should be ditched is because it is so extremely time-consuming for librarians. In my research, I was unable to find statistics on the amount of time that librarians and library staff spend shelving books, but this can be very different depending on a lot of factors of the library, right? What the circulation is, how much staff is dedicated to shelving, and so on and so forth. So in this section, I am going to speak from personal experience as a librarian. I, on average, at my libraries, my school libraries, would spend around 1 to 2 hours out of my 7 to 8 hour workday shelving books. So this comes to around 25 to 30% of my time in the library was spent shelving. Now, in my high school libraries, I had students who were able to help with that, and I was able to get some volunteers. But librarians who don't have those options are spending so much time shelving books. And the majority of that shelving comes from the nonfiction section, where we are shelving by Dewey Decimal number. The problem with this shelving and the reason that it takes so long is because some of my books in these libraries would have 4, 5, 6 digits after the decimal. So not only was I having to look at 6 different numbers and put them in numerical order, I was then having to alphabetize within categories of the same number. This is an extremely time-consuming process, and if Dewey were to be ditched, you would see that all of the proposals of new systems of organization would take much less time for librarians to shelve. And finally, and extremely importantly, The Dewey Decimal System of classification is not user-friendly. It is very librarian-centered, and in fact, the majority of patrons who do come to the library don't understand how to use or search within the Dewey Decimal System. In fact, in a study conducted by Kaplan, Stilschiff, and Dolliff in 2013, they found that not only did most patrons prefer to browse library shelves instead of searching for specific titles using a library catalog, but they also found that library patrons were not able to understand the differences between where different books fit. For example, when we talk about the 600 section or technology, we think about all the different subjects that fall into that section. So inventions, makes sense. Human body, okay, maybe. Electricity, absolutely. Robots, totally works. Cooking, now you're starting to lose them. Sewing, woodworking, pets. Many of these concepts do not make logical sense in today's world. During the time when Dewey was alive and all of these different inventions were starting to be created, they were aspects of technology. But in today's world, pets, which are classified in technology because of the use of farm animals, helping farmers to produce goods, does not make sense in our patrons' minds. The fact that fairy tales and folklore are classified in the 300 section, but other literature is in the 800 section. And in fact, according to the Dewey Decimal System, fiction should be categorized in the 800s as a form of literature. We'll come back to that point shortly. The fact that books on certain topics are also often found in multiple sections is extremely confusing to patrons and students as well. If students were to look in the 300s, they would find books about warfare and weapons, but all of the World War II books would be in the 940s. This makes it very difficult for someone who is trying to research everything they can find out about World War II and the weapons and warfare tactics that were used during that time. Finally, students especially, and older patrons as well, have a very difficult time finding books with very long Dewey Decimal numbers. And as mentioned previously, many of those numbers contain 5 or 6 digits after the decimal point. This is just not intuitive for anybody looking for a book. Even if they are able to use the catalog to search for those call numbers, most patrons, especially young students, are not able to independently go find those books on the shelves without asking for help from a librarian. Now, this is something that I can speak to firsthand. As a school librarian, I've seen time and time again that students go to shelves looking for a particular book and end up empty-handed. In fact, when given the choice, if students want to use the library catalog to search for books or browse the shelves, 95% of my students chose to browse the shelves instead of looking up specific titles. Now that we've discussed why it is so important to ditch Dewey, I would like to show you how to ditch Dewey. I believe that showing you some of the alternatives that have been used will make it very clear that Dewey is no longer necessary and that there are far superior systems of organization already in existence. First, I would like to discuss Professor Bogan's concept called the partial Dewey, or she also calls it Bogan's BISAC. As you can see here in these photos, the partial Dewey system is a system that still uses numbers and call numbers, just like the Dewey Decimal System did. However, these numbers have been very drastically changed. While I do not like that this system uses Dewey's name and do think that we need to refer to this as Bogan's BISAC from here on out, I do really like the functionality of this system. I first heard about it from a lecture that I listened to by Professor Bogan during my Info 237 course. And as I continued to follow Professor Bogan's blog on her journey ditching Dewey, I learned so much more about this system of organization that she's created. The only way that this system is similar to Dewey is the fact that it does use numbers and call numbers. Basically, Professor Bogan took the number system of organization and took out all of the decimals. So this system uses almost exclusively whole numbers. And she has completely changed what each of the numbers represent. On her blog, she actually provides a spreadsheet that shows exactly what numbers she used for which topic and gives a step-by-step guide of how any other librarians can continue to use this system. I think this system would particularly be wonderful in school libraries. I love the idea of getting rid of decimal point call numbers. This would not only help students find books more quickly, but it would also help eliminate so much time shelving. I also like that this system still does show students how to use a catalog to search for a call number and teaches students the concept that call numbers show the location of their books. So, as we'll discuss in some of our counter arguments, you will see that this concept is still fully teaching students how to use a library and will be very beneficial when students do enter libraries that have not yet ditched Dewey. Next is the bookstore model. And what I found during my research on the bookstore model is that essentially this model separates libraries into different large categories. So fiction and nonfiction turns into information and stories. And then within each of those categories, there are different topics. So adventure, animals, humor, poetry. As you can see, the physical aspect looks much more like a bookstore with many front-facing covers, and it is very visually appealing, which I think would be very beneficial to library patrons. The system that I researched the most was based on the experience of a blogger called Monarch Method. And on this person's blog, they discussed the time and energy that went into changing their library into a bookstore model. They also modified the typical bookstore model a little bit and noticed that students were so excited to browse and that this browsing experience was very similar to those on websites that the students are browsing, such as Amazon or Barnes and Noble. Very similar to my experience, Monarch Method said that their students never chose to use the library catalog. It was very, very rare and really just wanted to browse shelves. And because browsing is so common in libraries, we might as well have a setup that is compatible with browsing. The Dewey Decimal System could be great for looking for a specific book, but it does nothing for browsers. And these other systems of organization are just as easy to find specific books as the Dewey Decimal System itself. This bookstore model also includes genreifying the fiction section of our libraries, which I am also a very strong proponent of. So many of my students have begged me to genreify my library, but my district would not allow me to do so. But there is such high demand for genreified fiction. Kids and patrons know what they want and they want to be able to find it. When students come in and ask me for a horror book, and I have to take them around the library pointing out different authors and different sections, their faces just sink. Were I able to point to my horror section, I know for a fact that their faces would just light up and they would be able to find what they want and what they came in for. Finally, the category system. This system is a very, very unique system of classification, but I think it would be extremely effective. The way that it works is that the books are categorized with around 50 to 30 titles per subject that are placed within a section of the library. So as you can see here in this image, we have a section of natural disasters, a section for the environment, a section for energy, recycling, etc. And the unique thing about this system is that there are actually no call numbers. So you'll notice you can see the colored dots that correspond to the topics that these books are shelved in. But within those categories, there's no order for the book. And because there are only 15 to 30 titles per category, the books are easy to find. And even more importantly, they are easy for students to shelve, to browse, to go directly to the category that they are looking for. I think this would actually very much encourage students to look out of their comfort zone since it would be so easy to access different categories of books. So if I was looking for a book about energy, right next to it are books about recycling, and they're so easily labeled that as I am browsing, which patrons are most likely to do, I can glance over and start looking at different categories of books as well, which I think would expand student reading. Now, this is an argumentative presentation where I am defending my thesis that the Dewey Decimal System should be ditched. But of course, I know I'm going to face some counter arguments. So I want to address those counter arguments and give my rebuttals to show that these arguments are not something that will stand in the way of ditching Dewey. The most common argument that I hear for people who do not want to ditch the Dewey Decimal System is that we have to teach kids how to use a library. Now, this one mostly comes from school librarians, parents, people who are around young children in the library. And they are so concerned with the concept that kids have to know how to search for a book. Kids have to know how to use any library in the world. Well, there's a few rebuttals to this argument. First, many of the new systems that I just explained do show students how to use a library. Most of them still have books with call numbers and call catalogs where students can search for specific books and find their spot in the library. As you can see in the image above, even the category system, which does not use specific call numbers, still has spine labels that show where the book belongs. So the concept of having a label on the spine that shows where the book's home is on the shelf is still being taught to students through this new system, whichever they choose to adapt. Secondly, as a high school librarian, it is more than clear that my high school students still come to the library without knowing how to use the Dewey Decimal System. No matter how well we teach it in kindergarten through 8th grade, it just does not stick. And the reason it doesn't stick is because it is not intuitive to students. So if we're spending all this time teaching students how to find books based on complicated call numbers, and they're not retaining it anyway, this argument is completely invalid. And third, this is what circulation desk librarians are for. If a student goes into a public library and chooses not to browse, but instead wants to find a specific title, they can ask the circulation desk librarian. And in fact, students show that that's how they choose to find specific books anyway. Plus, in this day and age, students can actually choose, or patrons, I should say, can actually choose to go online on their public library's website, place the hold for a book, and go directly to the circulation desk to pick it up. So with so many options available for patrons to get help in the library, this is not an argument that we need to be worried about. The next counter argument that I hear quite frequently is that without uniformity, no one will understand how to find books. Well, this is just plain untrue. We can see this based on stores. When you walk into a grocery store and then the next week you're in a new neighborhood and you have to run in and grab something at the next store, nobody teaches you a lesson on how to find what you're looking for. You use your intuitiveness, you use your visual cues if you are not visually impaired to look for signs, to look for the ways that the store is organized. And if you still, based on those things, can't find what you're looking for, you ask somebody for help. In the exact same way, we intuitively navigate bookstores, pharmacies, supermarkets, you name it. Libraries can be used in the exact same way. So if you'll notice in the pictures here, on the picture on the left, you'll notice some very clear signage on the shelves that show exactly what is going to be found in that section. And over to the right, you'll see these beautiful blue banners that are showing exactly what patrons will find in which section of the library. And again, if all else fails, there is always going to be a reference desk for patrons to go and ask for help. Now, as another counter to this argument, it's also really important that I point out that libraries are not uniform anyway. Most libraries are already altering the Dewey Decimal System. In fact, if your library has a fiction and nonfiction section, your library is already not using the Dewey Decimal System in the way that it was intended to be used. For Dewey's system, literature should be in the 800s, meaning that there should be no nonfiction and fiction section. The fiction books should be placed in the 800 category of the general library. Now, we know that that's not the case for probably most libraries in the world. And because of this, different libraries have changed different aspects of Dewey based on their user needs for decades. And just because these small changes have been made, or even large changes in many cases, who have completely ditched Dewey, the uniformity is not what makes things easy to find in a library. Good signage, good staff, and intuitively designed spaces are what will help patrons find what they need. Finally, the counterargument, there is no time to develop a new system. It's probably the most valid of all the counterarguments, because this is true. It is very, very time consuming to ditch Dewey and to redo library shelving and book spines. That is without a doubt true. However, there are some workarounds. First, for anybody who is considering changing over to a new system, during my research, I found literally dozens and dozens of already pre-packaged assistance for ditching Dewey. So the example right here comes from Professor Bogan's website. This is a spreadsheet that she has provided access to, where you can see exactly how she recategorized all of her topics and how her numbers are corresponding to different book categories. Anybody wanting to ditch Dewey can literally go look at one of these systems and take everything they need to figure out how to implement this successfully. Librarians are so good at sharing, and if you are able to use the internet to find what you are interested in, I guarantee you there will be another librarian who has already done it, who is giving you the tools to help you. Secondly, you can also advocate for yourself. If you can advocate about the importance of ditching Dewey and why the Dewey Decimal System is so harmful, it is very likely that your boss or principal or whoever is supervising your work in the library would allow for a little bit of closure or some extra hands to help get this done. It is so important for our patrons, for our students, for our communities, and therefore, if we fight for it and prove its importance, we will be very likely to get help. Finally, this is particularly true for school libraries, but many libraries need to be boxed and packed up for library remodels, closures, moves, and this is a perfect time to start the system. A Dewey ditch does not have to take place overnight. In fact, it can be done extremely slowly, one book at a time. The importance is that we are working toward eliminating the harm that the Dewey Decimal Classification System is causing. I hope that my arguments have convinced you why we should ditch the Dewey Decimal Classification System. When a system of classification is causing more harm than good, and when there are other wonderful alternatives that can do just as much for our library organization, there's no reason to be holding on to this archaic and problematic system. Thank you so much for your time.